Noswaith dda, good evening, croeso a welcome to everybody. This is Plaid Cymru, and tonight we are going to be discussing criminal justice matters, and I have with me some special guests. Dafydd Llywelyn is the Plaid Cymru Police and Crime Commissioner for Dyfed-Powys Police, and he is seeking re-election in May 2021. Cindy Liz Ikie is a Black human rights activist. Nadine Marshall is a justice campaigner turned candidate, and Nadine's son, Connor, was murdered by an attacker who was on probation at the time. She became a campaigner for justice, and she is now standing for Plaid Cymru as a police and crime commissioner in the election in May 2021 for South Wales Police. And I am Plaid Cymru's Shadow Social Justice and Equalities Minister. I'm a former probation officer, and I'm chairing this evening's event. We're going to start by just asking each of the panelists to outline something positive that they've done for themselves during these difficult lockdown times. So first of all, I'll ask Nadine to start. Tell us something, Nadine, that you've done throughout lockdown that has been something good for yourself.
The main thing for me is that I've taken time out, whether it's half an hour or an hour, and I go for a walk. It sounds really simple and really basic, but I get the dogs and off I go, whether it's to Barry Island or even just to the local park. It just gives me that headspace and just to sort of break free for a bit.
Brilliant, thank you. Dafydd? I can't hear you, Dafydd. No. Can we go to Cindy? I think Dafydd was having some problems with his sound then. Cindy, something nice that you've done for yourself?
Yeah, so I've become a bit of a candle hoarder in our time in lockdown, and I gather candles like no man's business and light them all and enjoy all their scents, scented candles. That's what I love and that's what I've been doing.
That sounds really nice. That sounds great.
Very
Bit of time for yourself there.
Yeah.
Dafydd, can we try you now? No. Fleer has suggested take your headphones out, your headset. Try that.
Is that any better?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Oh,
yeah.
You can hear
Great.
me.
Good job we had this sound check.
Yeah, after all that, what I was trying to tell you is that I was racking my brains about something positive that you mentioned, because I've actually, eaten too much, probably drunk a little bit too much, and not been very healthy during the lockdown period. But what's I guess the nicest part for me is I spent so much time with the family, because normally, I'm traveling to Cardiff for meetings or going to London in my job as the Police and Crime Commissioner. But just to be able to spend so much time at home, being a father of 5 children and having a busy household here, it's been challenging, but that'll be the positive thing that I'll take out of what has been such an extraordinary year for everybody.
It's good to be able to hear everybody be able to say something positive, because you're right, there's been so much tragedy and so much difficulty around. But I think it's so important to be able to take that time out for ourselves, to protect our own mental well-being, and also to keep an eye out for those around us. And I've got to say, I'm a little bit jealous of Nadine having the beach to be able to go to walks on, even though I've got some fantastic mountains around where I am. I would love to be able to go to the beach, and I'm very much looking forward to being able to do that when times change. Okay, so we'll move on now. Tonight's focus is on the criminal justice system, crime, policing. There's lots of jargon words used when we discuss policy around criminal justice. So I'd like to start by us all thinking about what we mean by crime and justice, why we should care about it, and to think about whether or not the current England and Wales justice system is fit for purpose. My experience tells me that many people are let down by the criminal justice system in its current state. Is it fair, as things stand, to victims as well as everyone else who participates? I'd like to get Dafydd's take on that first, please.
Yeah, thank you, Leanne. I think it was such a wide topic of discussion, isn't it? You know, one thing I would like to make a comment right at the outset is, you know, the heart of any criminal justice system is individuals and people and families, and decisions, the policymakers are directly linked to, you know, individuals and the outcomes in relation to individuals and their wider families, and then the community thereafter. I think progress has been made over the last few years here in Wales for us to see it as a sort of a one system approach, so that we try and break down some of those silos. But the biggest barrier for me is this England and Wales setup at the moment, because that is due to goodwill as opposed to it being what is being developed in Wales, you know, for the people of Wales. We still, in effect, are funded from an England and Wales perspective, and that drives a lot of the decisions then that policymakers and the likes of myself as a police and crime commissioner can influence. So that I think is a barrier, but I think it's important for all of us, and you know, I know others will come in and talk about personal experiences, you know, that the people and families are at the heart of the decisions that are being made. And if you look back at history, you know, Welsh law, you know, is embedded in that repairing of harm and the repairing of the harm to the community. And I think that certainly would be something I would want to see being developed in an all Wales criminal justice system.
Thank you for that answer. I'll come to Cindy next, and just if you can outline, Cindy, what you think of when we talk about crime and in particular justice.
To me, when I think about crime, I immediately go to a fuller, broader picture that involves society as a whole. And I think about how different societies engage with in each other, engage with individuals within that society in various different ways, depending on where you are in the world. And so in relation to crime, when I think about that, I think about how society sets for itself the tone of what is acceptable and what is unacceptable behavior. And so when one is behaving in an abhorrent way based on those values, that value system, people then say such a person is behaving as a criminal. And in way of justice, the word justice, of course, like most people, you see the lady fair holding her weighing scales. And I think of how we're supposed to be able to balance fairness and equality at all time, whilst providing a very steadfast type of dignity to all individuals that participate in our society. So those are the things that come to mind, Leanne, for me, whenever thinking of crime and justice.
Thank you for giving us that perspective. I'll move on to Nadine with this question now, and I suspect, Nadine, you might have a slightly different slant to this question. Can you answer? What is crime and justice to you?
Hi there. Yeah, thanks, Leanne. I'm a bit like the rotten apple, really, because my answer doesn't sort of mirror what we've just heard, really. Crime and justice, to me, it just creates a feeling of pain, of terror, sadness, all the sort of the negatives that you can think of, all rolled up into one split second. But then to flip it on its side, we've got justice. That again is questionable in our case because of my own personal experience with the justice system. It did fail us and more importantly Connor, and picking up on what Dafydd said, what was very, very clear from the beginning was that, you know, had Westminster not been in charge and things, you know, the criminal justice system was brought into Wales and for Wales, then very much, I don't know whether the outcome would have been any different, but certainly the battle to get answers would have been a lot simpler and not having to be passed back and forth from from Cardiff to London and back again, and people shrugging their shoulders.
I think you're absolutely right in what you say there, Nadine, and central to the question in your situation was the question of the probation service and the ownership of the probation service and how it was run as a privatised organisation, which was, of course, driven by the austerity agenda. There was an attempt for the Home Office to save money, and so they pursued the privatisation of the probation service. That's something that you've particularly campaigned upon. And if we were able to run our own justice system here in Wales, I believe that we would be much less likely to go down the privatisation route. Is that something that fits in with your way of thinking about the devolution and this England and Wales justice model, Nadine?
Absolutely, yes, because for us, and sadly we're not the only family affected in Wales or outside of Wales by an experiment ultimately that went tragically wrong, has cost lives and millions of pounds to a system that simply wasn't fit for purpose. So for me, it would most definitely need to be brought back in, devolved with specific structures inbuilt and procedures and processes, policies that emanate that as well.
Thank you for that. I mean, sticking to the theme of cuts and austerity, I'll come to you next, Dafydd, and perhaps you can outline the impact of all of this, particularly in terms of how police forces have been able to respond to crime and the way in which those cuts have effectively minimised the way that you want to do your job. You know, that you've not been able to do everything that you've wanted to do, I'm sure, because of financial constraints. Can you outline some of that for us, how that's impacted on communities?
Yeah, it's very significant. I think that there are aspects of it which are, thankfully, have been protected in Wales for various reasons, primarily over recent years, because the local council taxpayer, in effect, has been, I guess, shouldering a greater burden from the police resources perspective as a result of the reduction in funding direct from Westminster. But, you know, I can recall, if we go back to the beginning of the austerity measures, if we go back nearly 10 years, you know, I had individuals that I was friendly with in other police forces across England and Wales, and they were talking about, you know, significant major operations into organised crime groups having to be scrapped, for example. That is the reality of some of the cuts back at that time. And when we now see the current government talking about 20,000 additional officers being recruited, as great news that is, they're not 20,000 in addition. They're actually 20,000 to bring us back to the level that we were 10 years ago. So that is the reality. And we've gone through a period of time where I think in particular, and it has affected England particularly acutely, I think, there has been a lack of community policing activity and presence, and that links to visibility, which is what the public want to see. Really, they want to see the police within their towns and cities and villages. Even in the Dyfed-Powys area, where we transcended 2/3 the landmass of Wales, and we've got what might be described as quite a sparse population. People want to see their neighbour policing teams. So what we've managed to do, I suppose, over recent years in Wales in particular, we have some Welsh Government funding for police community support officers, and that's been we've been able to ring fence that over a period of time, which is fantastic. And we've sort of refreshed and re-energized the neighbourhood policing teams, and again trying to ensure that there are resources within communities. That I think if we went back to sort of the early years of austerity, there was a pull away from some of that. So it has impacted dramatically. But of course, it isn't just policing, it's all the agencies that we interact with. So we interact with many of the agencies in the criminal justice system, but also with schools and colleges from a crime prevention point of view, working with youth services who have had significant cuts through the cuts to the unitary authority. So it isn't just a singular sort of vision of cuts that have affected policing, it's what's affected all the other agencies, and that has culminated, sadly, into, you know, a reduction of services and an increase in some aspects of, you know, criminality. We've seen things like county lines coming to the fore. But I'd like to say that certainly the last few years, being the Police and Crime Commissioner Dyfed-Powys, you know, we've managed to try and put back some of that resource and try and ensure that we've now got more police officers than we've had for many years. We've got a refresh of our neighbourhood policing team, and that, you know, that is pleasing to see. But that comes, as I said earlier, with a bit of a sort of a cost, I guess, which is that local taxation balance, which is quite challenging.
Yeah, I think funding services is going to be challenging after this many years of austerity, isn't it? Staying with the theme of those services linked to policing and cuts, Cindy, I wonder if there's anything you want to say about, I'm a big advocate of youth work in particular, and I know that youth work budgets have been absolutely annihilated over the last few years. They're the easy thing to cut. How does that impact in terms of relations on the ground between various agents of the state, if you like the police, but also social workers and all those other agencies that work in communities? After cuts, you know, they pull away from communities and make people more distant from them. Is there anything that you want to say about that, Cindy?
Yes, most certainly. The youth are very important. They are indeed the future. Without trying to sound like I'm just repeating a cliche on a broken record, it is the truth. They are the future. And I work quite closely with them as a tutor, so I know them quite well, I'd like to think. And what I find is that the cuts have made the whole dynamic change on the ground. Where once young people had youth clubs to attend and were being shepherded in all the best ways by a youth worker, they no longer have that. That's a massive gap now. They no longer have that direction, and constant direction, actually. And a place where they can be themselves and learn to be better versions of themselves, interact outside of the educational environment with other young people, meet a lot of different young people from various different backgrounds, because it was youth centres, for instance, were hubs for youth to come and join together and meet one another and make new friends and learn more about different communities, the communities in which they live, in a safe way. Now we find that there are next to no youth clubs, no such spaces really. I can't remember the last time I saw one. And I know that many community leaders within the Black and Asian and minority ethnic communities have done lots of things to try and create such spaces to replicate that, but it's just nothing near what it used to be. I can say that with confidence, having been someone who attended youth clubs regularly myself. Yeah, I used to really enjoy them. I made a lot of friends. I knew a lot of young people who otherwise would have got themselves into trouble because unfortunately they were in the vicinity where they could be lured by people who had the wrong intentions for them. But because they were so regularly, so consistently spending time in the youth club, they didn't fall victim to that sort of lifestyle. So I know from speaking from experience that it is a beating heart. It's needed for our youth. It's a valuable space. And with these cuts, we don't get to interact with our communities the way we would love to. We don't even get to interact with our police officers the way we would love to, because police officers used to be part of the people who would visit, make themselves known in a very positive way, you know, and people used to know them by name, and they used to equally know the youth by name and know which youth club to which they belonged. So it's been a complete community shattering experience, I'd say, the cuts in that regard for youth. Most definitely.
Thank you.
And in fact,
Cindy,
it's something we're campaigning on to change.
Sorry, I there was a bit of a delay then, I think, in the in the broadcast. Before I come to Nadine, I'm not sure if you've got anything you want to add to what's been said about cuts. I'll leave that with you for a second to have a think about. I just wanted to come to one of the comments. I've just discovered the comments, actually. I've only just switched them on, so apologies to everybody who said hello, and including you, John Luckwell, who said bore da. It's I don't know what time it is where you are, but it's noswaith dda for us. Bore da is good morning, just for you to know for the future. And there's some interesting comments here. Stuart Snedden is a youth worker, and he says, I know that if money is invested into the youth service, then we can help the young people to avoid the criminal justice altogether. Unfortunately, as the funding is poor, we feel we're just firefighting. And I think that's a point that Cindy was just making. And I think that may be something that Nadine may have a view or something to say on before we move on, Nadine.
Yeah, I do. I would agree with Cindy that, you know, the actual vision of youth now is completely different to 5 years ago, to 10 years ago, and there is a serious lack of provision for the youth to do anything other than be in front of a screen at the moment. Money is obviously the root of all evil, because if we could have enough of it to do everything, then maybe we wouldn't even be having this conversation, you know, this evening. But I do think that there's a huge case for definitely investment in youth services and a more holistic approach to policing in general, that it's not just left to the police officers to police, you know, and to wait until everything has gone bad before we interject. I think that it needs early provision, early intervention, and that support network that very often is created from something like a youth club can be absolutely vital to some, you know, youngsters that don't have that provision at home for whatever reason.
I think you're so right, and I really don't think we can sing the praises of youth work enough. I mean, I'm talking a long time ago now, but during the 1980s, I attended a youth club and had some fantastic youth workers, and I can tell you now that at that time there were a lot of hate speech going around towards gay men. And it was a particular issue that's been brought to light with Channel 4's It's a Sin recently. You know, the stigma towards gay men at that point in time was horrific. And I remember our youth workers showing us films, challenging our views and assumptions and narratives around at the time. And some of us, you know, became quite militantly pro-gay rights as a result of the intervention of those youth workers. And I think that not having that presence now in our communities in the way that we had it then is really meaning that a lot of these narratives and assumptions, particularly that breed hate crime, go unchallenged, and it's a real problem. So bring back the youth workers, bring back the youth clubs, bring back those conversations that young people need to have in order to enable us all to live together without stigma and prejudice. Okay, I'll stop there now.
Can you just come back in? I just wanted to just very briefly, you know, a shameless plug really on you know, behalf of the work that I've been doing over the last few years. You know, I give a grant of 180,000 direct from my office, because one of the things that people perhaps don't realise is the Police and Crime Commissioners commission services. You know, it does what it says on the tin, I suppose. Police commissioners, we commission services. But you know, we've not put too many strings attached to it. We're putting in an investment into the youth service provision in each of the 4 counties of the Dyfed-Powys area, to the tune of 180,000 per year over the last 4 years. And that is to exactly what Nadine said about that prevention and early intervention with young people, you know, that educating. And then that links to the fantastic schools police activity that we've got, resources that work directly within schools as part of what is called the School Beat programme. And just those 2 examples for me are innovative ways in which we can work partly within the current devolved settlement, but also gives us an eye towards the future of what it would look like if we had full control of our own criminal justice system and all of the levers of power and finances, how innovative we could be. Because I can tell you now, when I interact with my counterparts across the border in England, they are very envious and jealous of what we have in Wales. But our ambition is to make it even better, isn't it? That's just something I wanted to share.
Great, thank you for that. I'm going to ask Cindy to come in next now. Oh, sorry, I was going to ask Nadine. Wasn't it? Were you going to come and respond to something then, Nadine? No. Apologies. I want to move on to the next section now. We have covered cuts, austerity, youth work, and so on. So I'd like to move on to the question of Black Lives Matter and the criminal justice system now. Big questions to address there. Black, Asian, minority ethnic people are overrepresented as offenders in Wales and are thus acutely exposed to the dangers within prisons, including COVID-19, as well as self-harm, which has increased substantially in Welsh prisons since 2010. We also have had the case of Mohammed Hassan, a 24-year-old Black Welshman who died on the 9th of January at his home in Cardiff after being released from police custody that day. There is no recourse to public funds. Many people are unable to get proper and adequate legal representation and fair treatment within the justice system, depending on their immigration status. And we have a lack of facilities for women offenders in Wales, that you are unable as a woman to serve your sentence in this country if you were sentenced to prison. And again, we have way too many women incarcerated in Wales. So there are many, many questions that arise from all of this. The disparity of treatment and outcomes for Black and minority ethnic people within the criminal justice system is clear. The evidence is there. Is the criminal justice system racist, would you say, Cindy?
Most certainly so. It's most certainly institutionally racist, without a shadow of a doubt. It shows in all the numbers, and it shouldn't have to show in all the numbers first for us to pay attention. We should be able to listen to one another and be able to pay attention from there. But the numbers do. If one is not convinced by just the lived experiences of others, then the numbers are also doing the job of reflecting this large disparity that we are currently experiencing and seeing. I don't know if many people know, but as of May 2020, most of our prisons were overpopulated, 49% overpopulated on a whole. Many of those are prisons situated in Wales as well. And in terms of is our system on crime and justice system fit for purpose? Well, no, it's harboring way too many individuals. It's at the point of breaking point, and people are living, because people in prison do live, and they are living in situations and environments that are deemed indecent because it's overpopulated. Hence why we would have COVID-19 ravaging through such spaces. And then when you take into consideration that I believe it's about 27% of Black and Asian minority ethnic people are overrepresented in prisons at the moment, in comparison to the 13% of the general population which they represent. So, of course, we're going to be heavily hit as an ethnic minority group, as people who fit within that identification, because we are being put into spaces that are prepped and primed for such ravaging of such viruses. And in addition, we're overrepresented within those groups. And let's not forget, though we are saying that Black and Asian and minority ethnic people are overrepresented in such spaces, let's remember that they are not the majority of people found in those spaces. The majority of people found in the prison space, for instance, are white people, meaning we should care, no matter what, because people are people. And all people right now are finding themselves in such dire situations, as we know how hard it's been during COVID-19 for those of us who are free and have our liberty in completion, let alone what it must be like for those who are imprisoned. We must always find some semblance of humanity, no matter whom we are referring to, because that's the right and proper way to be. At least that's the society in which I was raised. So most definitely we are suffering as a people. I refer to my people as we, as I'm part of them. We are suffering. The hand of justice right now, as it is, because it is being wielded by a racist lady fair, it's very heavy. The burden is heavy. We are stopped and searched at higher rates to our white counterparts. It's very intimidating. Just the other day, a few days ago, I was within a talk where young people specifically were giving accounts of their experiences of stop and search within Wales, and it was harrowing. Many young people have been stopped and searched whilst in school uniform, and within that stop and search have been asked where it is they were coming from, despite the fact that it's after school hours and they are still in their school uniform. So our young people from Black and Asian minority ethnic backgrounds are being bullied and harassed by police officers. And that is not the way it ought to be. Unfortunately, those practices are racist. They are being wielded in a racist way, and they're not fit for purpose, because they are disproportionately affecting a particular race in a very negative way, leading to their overrepresentation within the prison systems, within the court systems, with very, very heavy-handed sentencing as well, which I believe the David Lammy report pertains to. Very heavy sentences indeed in comparison to their white counterparts and the white population. So no, the criminal justice system is not working in its current state, and it is racist, in my opinion.
Thank you, and I agree with everything that you've said there. You touched on two areas that could potentially change. One is the stop and search, and the other is sentencing policy, which you referred to, was mentioned in the David Lammy review. This is something that needs serious looking at. If you can think of other examples of policies that could be pursued that would change this particular issue around racism. I mean, I agree with what you say about the overcrowding generally within prisons. When I practiced as a probation officer in the mid-90s, I remember the then Home Secretary was Michael Howard, and we were scathing of him for allowing the prison population to reach 45,000. Now, looking back on that, the prisons were, you know, there must have been plenty of room in them, because they doubled now. And the number of people incarcerated since the mid-90s has doubled from 45,000. And as you say, they are way overcrowded and absolute terrible places for COVID to take hold. So can you think of other issues, other policy issues, other things that could be done if we were in charge of the criminal justice system to end this practice of institutional racism within the criminal justice system?
Yeah, certainly. I believe that we would be able to put funding where it belongs. For instance, allowing for Black and Asian and minority ethnic people to have a proportionate access to justice, given that many of the reductions in funds, for instance, those that of legal aid, caused for those particular communities to be more heavily and disproportionately affected by that limitation of access to justice. And given the current status that we're in after Brexit, unfortunately to have to mention in this space, but after Brexit, hate crimes increased against Black and Asian and minority ethnic people. So meaning that such people who identify as such need more access to the justice system in order to be able to pursue comfortably when they're seeking justice, to be able to pursue their justice. But where there are cuts to legal aid, many people cannot duly afford to pursue their justice, or don't feel comfortable, or just have the belief that they can't because of the current status of things. I mean, let's not forget that everything is intertwined. I mentioned earlier my vision of crime and justice and how I look at it as a whole society. And within this current society, Black and Asian and minority ethnic people tend to be the most poor. They also tend to be precise, living in poverty. They also seem to be time poor, because they're having to work so many jobs in order to try and meet up. And then in addition to that, we are also, long before COVID, health poor. So there are many things and many constraints that already were feeding into this lack of access to justice. And then you put in the cuts to legal aid. That happened a long while ago now, if my memory serves me correctly, though I was probably quite young then. But yes, we could do more. I believe that if we was able to lead our country forward, Wales, independently of every other nation, we would do so much more. Look at the conversation we're having now. Look at the space that we've created now. It's a testament to the fact that we would be able to do better, so much better.
Thank you very much for that. I'll mention that a couple of the comments. Baris Karabulut has offered to get involved and suggested we need more people from foreign backgrounds involved. I absolutely agree. We as Plaid Cymru need to reflect Wales as a society, so we want everyone to be involved, and whether you can speak Welsh or not is not relevant. We obviously stand up for the Welsh language, but as somebody who's not a fluent Welsh speaker myself, there are many of us active within the party, and it certainly shouldn't be seen as a barrier to activity and membership. So thank you, Catherine Lloyd, for making that point. Abid Quinn Aziz has said that I think, as well as policies in the criminal justice system, we would need to think more broadly to challenge structural racism, which the police, prisons, courts are just a part of. Otherwise, this maintains the unequal system, and that's absolutely right. And it touches on some of the points that were made earlier on about education as well, and the importance of youth work, but also Dafydd mentioned about going into schools, and I think anti-racist work in schools is really, really important.
Leanne, can I just say as well, on sort of that theme of the any sort of racism or anything like that isn't acceptable in any form of life, whether it's a workplace, homestay, wherever. And I think if it does occur, it does need to be called out, but we need to have structures in place so that people feel that they can do that without fear of redress or being ridiculed or anything. And for me, when we talked about the criminal justice system, how it should look, I think that another really important factor is obviously, from my point of view, is victims of crime, and they come from all walks of life. To be a victim of crime, it doesn't discriminate, but they're still not part of a justice system yet, and that needs to be changed. It needs to be turned on its head that victims are a result of a system that isn't working. So I think that early intervention is absolutely clear and key to success. Sorry.
No, you're right. Thank you for pointing that on. I want to move on to the Wales needing its own policing and justice system, because I think that within the current setup, it's very difficult, as you would know, Nadine, to change things within the way the Home Office is set up, and the accessibility, the inability to reach the people that you need to reach. And my view of devolution in general is, if you can have decision making closer to the people that it affects, then it is more likely to be policy that meets their needs. So I wondered if we can, I'll come to you, Dafydd, first. Why is Wales having its own police and criminal justice system so important? What impact would it have in our communities? How could it make a real difference in people's lives? And in particular, I'd just like to address this question that Yasmin has thrown up about the prison population that we did talk about last time, and the fact that you're 6 times more likely to be incarcerated in Wales if you're black than if you're white. How could devolving the criminal justice system help with all of that? And I'll come to Cindy after Dafydd.
Yeah, thank you, Leanne. And now for me, all of what we've discussed this evening echoes of why we should have justice and policing devolved, because all of what we want to put right at the moment, some of those levers of powers are not within our gift. So, for example, I chair the local criminal justice board, and I also sit as an active member of the Justice in Wales board. But it doesn't sit on any statutory footing. They are boards of, like-minded people trying to do the right thing and relies on goodwill. What we need is those levers of powers and opportunities to actually legislate directly in relation to some of this and be innovative and change. And to hear some of the comments that Cindy made, and then the reflection by Nadine, is why we want criminal justice and policing devolved. Now, what we could do more of is we could invest more in youth services, that early intervention activity that we mentioned. We're doing some of that now, but again, it relies on too much goodwill in effect. So we're relying on a public health approach within the criminal justice system, but that comes from working with, Public Health Wales, working with unitary authorities, and again, all of the levers of powers that we ultimately need, a lot of them are devolved, but we're in a non-devolved, straitjacket. Shall I call it a straitjacket? That's certainly how it feels. Now, that isn't abdicating any responsibility for some of the things that were described earlier. And I'm going to try and put some more positive sort of notes in relation to the conversation we just had, in particular around racism and the disproportionality within the system. As the Police and Crime Commissioner, I need to seek reassurance that the force is not being disproportionate. And we have what is referred to as a quality assurance panel. We have individuals that individually go through stop and search records. So, for example, things like technology, such as body-worn cameras, is an opportune time for us to learn lessons from interactions, but also to scrutinize. And we're doing that on a daily basis. So I think it's about 87% of the stop checks that were of the BAME community in the Dyfed-Powys area in the last quarter, they have body-worn footage. That body-worn footage goes through the quality assurance panel to ensure and to give me reassurance as the police and crime panel that there isn't disproportionality at play, because currently the statistics show and come to the conclusions like Cindy did that there is disproportionality, and in order to make a significant difference, I personally feel that we need to have greater levers of powers. The prisons issue is a significant one. We see HMP Berwyn being built on the outskirts of Wrexham. I visited there about 3 years ago and asked the question, how many of these inmates are actually from Wales? And at that time, it was about 16%. And my understanding is it hasn't increased from 16%. If anything, it's gone down. And we've seen some shocking commentary and news recently about the Welsh language being restricted and not being people being punished for the use of the Welsh language in a prison which is in Wales, which is ridiculous. So all of those things, I think the strategic outlook we'd be able to shape ourselves. And then we'd also, through the financing and the levers of powers I talk about, we'd then be able to put we would be able to put building blocks in place for a better future that doesn't have disproportionality, that doesn't bias towards one cohort against another, and gives everybody a fair opportunity. And just finally, because I know I've gone on a bit there now, is the legal aid issue, I think, is significant, but is disproportionately affects people who ultimately they don't have the means to support themselves through those processes. And they are complex processes that require that advice and guidance which has been taken away, sadly.
Thank you for that, Dafydd. And it is reassuring to know that this the stop and search figures are being looked at. I would be more reassured, I suppose, if I knew that there were many people of colour inputting into that process, just as I would feel more reassured if I understood that there were Welsh speakers having an input into language policy in HMP Berwyn. There are way too many issues here that are not being dealt with in a just way, but these things could potentially be put right if we were able to scrutinise these areas of policy in the Senedd, I think potentially. Cindy, why is it important to you, over and above the issues that we've just talked about, or you might want to come back to some of those, for Wales to have its own policing and justice system? And what difference do you think it would make to people's lives?
I think personally, it's the statistics that scream at me, because they are very, very shocking. They're very shocking. I mean, we have statistics such as on the general as a whole, children of all ethnicities, their criminalization has dropped over the years, but the ones that have increased are seen the Black population of children being. That's the only area in which we have criminalization of children having increased. So that's very shocking because, I mean, we're honing back in on the conversation we were having about the youth. So can one then argue that perhaps the cutting of the funding for the youth services is disproportionately affecting Black youth specifically because of the fact that our system is very widely institutionally, structurally racist? We need to ask some questions about that. And those are the sort of difficult questions that I know I've had the privilege of asking whilst within Plaid. I always think if you want to change a system, you need to participate in a way, you have to be involved, and you need to be in there and have your voice heard, just as my voice is being heard now, and very much so through the section that is Plaid BME, which I can't sing highly of. I just can't. I don't have the notes in me currently to sing the highest praises. It's fantastic. It's fantastic, and the cohesion as well. The way in which I can belong to that section because that is where I feel at home, but be very, very much at home at Plaid. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. I am at home at Plaid, and I'm happy to be at home with Plaid. And I feel like I would. If one was to join, for instance, even though it looks as though on the surface you may feel as though you don't belong, you do, because look at me, I'm here. When you join, you realize that you can have these conversations, these difficult conversations, without the awkwardness that is sometimes associated in many other spaces. You don't get any of the awkwardness. I can put my foot down here and say that, look, Black people are disproportionately stopped and searched. That's a fact, and nobody argues with that. Instead, we think about what can we do going forward to challenge that, to stop that from happening. And the fact that those conversations are happening are meaningful, very meaningful indeed. I think one of the other things that really shocks me about the stats and the things that I would know would change because of the conversations we're able to have is the fact that disproportionate use of force from the police for young people and adults alike, all Black people in generally, is a lot higher than it is in the white population. I think for tasers is about 8 times more likely than the white counterparts to be tased. The statistics say that. So we have to sort of realize that we need to be in spaces where we can have these conversations, where we're being listened to and heard, such as in Plaid. That's why I get in Plaid. And then we need to think about how we might change policing policy and perhaps even training. I know that's a massive deal on the Black Lives Matter Wales manifesto, upping the training of our police officers, moving away from using stereotypes as markers for whether or not you should stop and search someone, and being able as well to put the funding back in, as Dafydd was saying, at real levels, not just meeting, I think, David, you were saying that earlier, not just meeting the levels we had previously before the cuts, but actually surpassing and doing better, so that our police officers are fully trained, enough of them, because visibility is actually an issue even within the Black and Asian minority ethnic population too. From research I've done, we too also want to see more police officers around. We want to feel safe. We want to feel like if you were to give them a call, they would show up on time and you'd get help on time as well, rather than late. So, I mean, it's all interconnected, and it's not about pushing blame necessarily, but one thing I can say is that from the discussions I've had with Plaid, we're progressive. We want to move forward and we want to change the way our society looks, to be more well-centered, to be honest.
Oh, that's so encouraging to hear that, Cindy, I have to say. And it is about having those conversations, because we'll change nothing unless we can change opinions. And we won't change opinions unless we can explore these issues in a safe space. Nadine, before I come to you, I just want to I want to ask you to give us your reflections on why you think Wales should have control over policing and criminal justice, and what impact that would have on people's lives. But I just wanted, before I do that, to flag up something that Mandy Garden has said in the comments. Mandy says Scotland is looking to treat some drug issues with a health policy and not a criminal issue. Do you think that an independent Wales would consider something similar? So after Nadine has answered the last question, I've just flagged that up because I'd like to finish the event with that point. Should drugs be a public health issue, and could we do something about that if we had control over these matters? And I'll come to Dafydd after Nadine has answered the devolution question. So Nadine.
Obviously, yeah, I think that it has to happen, devolution. It's the only way that very many problems are going to be at least discussed, if not solved, because as it is, the current system isn't working. It's not working for one group of people. It's not working for everybody across the criminal justice service. Whoever is feeding into it, there are problems, there are issues, and that there are policies that don't fit. There are procedures that aren't working. And I think that part of that needs to be addressed by being devolved, so that there is sort of a centre where everybody is singing off the same sheet, that we're not having to play catch up or maybe refer back to a policy that was created 40, 50 years ago that isn't now relevant in the modern day that we live in. So definitely devolution is most certainly the way to go from my point of view.
So just briefly, before we finish up on that point, I know that you worked really, really hard to get various things changed within the system in terms of information sharing with families after they've gone through a horrific situation that your family went through. And I know you found it really, really difficult in some cases to access those people in the Home Office. But you persisted and you got there in the end. But not everybody's got the same level of fighting them, for want of a better word, than you have got, Nadine. So would it be easier? Would your work have been easier if you could have done all your focus in Cardiff Bay instead of having to go to London all the time?
Absolutely, of course it would have, because we were constantly chasing our tail. Cardiff would tell us one thing, and then we'd have to refer back to Westminster, and then that would be a different story again. And it was just the lack of accessibility to everything, not just a particular question. It was the whole system. Breaking it down back to the legal aid issue, we weren't whatever a normal family was that was allocated legal aid. We tried 3 or 4 times for it. We had to crowdfund, we had to sort of sink all our savings, everything into it to be able to get the answers that we needed, and that shouldn't be happening. Isn't it enough that you've lost what we've lost without losing a whole lifestyle as well with it? And that's what happens. And thank goodness we're a strong enough family that we've held it together, but there are so many others that don't, and that shouldn't happen. That can't happen.
I don't know how you've done it all, Nadine. I really don't. And here you are now, ready to take on the next challenge and ready to take on the next fight. So well done, you.
Thank you.
There are loads of other comments. I don't think we're going to be able to get through all of them, but I really would like to touch on this substance use question, drugs. It's a criminal justice issue at the moment. Criminal justice is not devolved. There are clearly huge health implications. The number of people of deaths as a result of drugs and alcohol is way too high in this country. What can we do to tackle that? And does independence offer solutions on that front? Dafydd, we've got 4 minutes left, so I'm going to have to ask you all to be really quite concise in the answer to this question.
That's fine. So the short answer is yes and yes. And yes, it should be a public health approach, and that's where we should focus this whole debate. Because I think if we frame it from a legal point of view, we just tie ourselves up into knots ultimately. So we currently have a system where there is needle exchange activity within our communities, within the current legislation, but we wave people away from that facility to use those needles, in a bed sit, on a street corner. That cannot be healthy for our communities. So I think we do genuinely need to have a very grown-up conversation about this. Another plug, as you would expect from me, as a candidate going forward as a police and crime commissioner in the Dyfed-Powys area, one of the biggest things I've done since being in the office for the last 5 years is to create an offender diversionary scheme. So we're giving individuals at that lower end of offending a second chance in effect. So it's well versed in the youth setup, in the youth services where we have youth bureaus. But the service that I have, and actually Arfon has got something very similar in North Wales called Checkpoint Cymru. 3/4 of the landmass of Wales. If you go through our policing system, there's an offender diversionary scheme that will assess vulnerabilities in relation to housing, vulnerabilities in relation to mental health, alcoholism, substance misuse, the key indicators, and then seek to work with you as an individual to try and ensure that you don't reoffend. So we try and break that cycle of reoffending. And that's in play now because we've got 2 police and crime commissioners from Plaid Cymru in North Wales and in Dyfed-Powys. Our ambition is to have more police and crime commissioners across Wales, so we can be even more progressive in the work that we've been doing over recent years. And just if I can, Leanne, can I just say what a privilege it is to being on this session with you this evening, 3 formidable women within Plaid Cymru, and it's been brilliant. So thank you.
Great, thank you for that. And I just do need to reference the work that Arfon Jones has done on this area. Arfon has been a real advocate for reform of substance misuse policy. I agree with him that it makes very little sense to treat people as criminals if they're struggling with a substance use problem, but we do that far too often. And it gives me great pleasure that another formidable woman in the form of Anne Griffith is hoping to continue with Arfon Jones's work, and she is going to be the Plaid Cymru Police and Crime Commissioner for the North, hopefully to take over from Arfon after the election in May. Quickly, I'll come to you, Nadine, about this question of substance use and the policy around it being treated as a public health issue as opposed to a criminal justice issue. What are your views on that?
I would mirror what Dafydd has just explained so beautifully, that it's a yes and a yes. It's a no-brainer. It's such a big problem, and the potential for it to get even bigger. It needs to be looked at completely differently and addressed. And as you say, Dafydd, be innovative and forward-thinking.
And finally, I'll come to you on this question, Cindy.
Yes, I think it's definitely something that it would be too irresponsible not to consider, not to converse about, actually. So as you can see, Mandy, and I want to say I really thoroughly enjoyed your question, and I'm enjoying the question very much. Thank you so much for it. I hope you remember already, because we need more of those sort of questions. I think, yes, most definitely, something that has to be very seriously considered, because it is a matter of health, in my opinion, and not of criminalisation.
Absolutely, and I think that we would see a different profile in prisons were this issue taken out of the criminal justice system and people treated and helped for illnesses, because that's what we're talking about here. And then when we're talking about people who use drugs and alcohol that don't have problematic use, then we need to be thinking about taking them out of the criminal justice system too, because then we can focus the criminal justice system on the work that needs to be done in terms of rehabilitating people and turning their lives around so that they can live with us in communities without causing grief to other people. We've had a really interesting discussion. We've only touched on many of the issues, and we've not been able to touch on many more, but our time, unfortunately, is up. I need to remind everyone that the Police and Crime Commissioner election takes place on the same day as the Senedd election, currently scheduled for the 6th of May. It makes sense in these strange times that we're in to sign up for a postal vote if you're not already signed up for a postal vote. We don't know what the situation will be in terms of going to the ballot stations in May. So it makes sense to be registered for a postal vote if you're not already. Finally, if there are any further questions that have arisen tonight that you haven't been able to ask, please feel free to get in touch with Plaid Cymru. I, as the crime and equalities and justice spokesperson for the party, will endeavour to respond to those queries. And if you've got specific questions for our Police and Crime Commissioner candidates, we'll get those questions to them for you, and we'll try to make sure they're answered as well. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very, very much to our panellists and to all of you for your questions, for the staff support in the background. Have a good evening, everyone. Diolch yn fawr.
Diolch.